Hello, and welcome to HHH, the podcast where we talk about the horrible humans in history. I am your host, Angela Pearson, and welcome today. I do want to warn you if you hear any creepy wind-blown sounds or potentially my dog, it's because it's storming outside and my dog's a little scared. So it's just setting the ambiance here. But anyways, welcome today. I am so excited to talk about the individual we're talking about today. And the reason why I'm actually excited is this was a listener request. So someone who actually listens to the podcast, Natalie, shouting out to you, has requested that we cover this individual. So today we are going to be talking about someone who has inspired horror stories across the nation. And I'm not actually going to tell you which horror stories or which movies or books he's inspired, because I want you to guess as I go along and explain the story and see if you can actually guess which ones he inspired. Now, the person I'm talking about today actually only killed 2 people, and while killing anyone is horrible, you might be thinking, that's actually not that bad compared to who you've talked about in the past. So why are you going to talk about this person? Well, just hold on. It gets crazy. And today you might recognize the name. And guys, we know I'm really bad at pronouncing names. I always want to say his name wrong. So if I say it wrong, just ignore it. Just move on. Okay. His name is Ed Gien. And I am so excited to talk about him and the horrible things he has done. And yes, he's killed 2 people, but it gets so much worse. So tune in and hold on, because we're going to go for a wild ride today. Also, make sure you're liking and subscribing and sharing this with everybody that you think would enjoy this kind of podcast. And follow me on Instagram so you can see pictures of these horrible humans. Let's get into this. All right, guys. So, Edward Theodore Gien. I keep wanting to say Jean or Jean. It's Gien. Edward Theodore Gien was born August 27th, 1906, to George Philip and Augusta Gien in La Crosse, Wisconsin. He was actually their second child, so he was the youngest of 2 children. And like so many other people that we have already talked about, his father, George, was actually a raging alcoholic, and his mother was a religious zealot. Shocker. I feel like that's the story of most of the people that we've talked about. Their father is an alcoholic and their mother is super religious. And I mean, for Augusta, she was Looney Tunes religious, not just like I go to church on Sunday. It's I am the most holy person on the planet and everyone else around me is evil. And this is going to have a really severe impact on Ed later in life. So just hold on, because that will come back to haunt them literally later in life. So in most of the stories that we've talked about, the alcoholic father was the abusive parent in the relationship. But in this scenario, it's flipped around. Augusta was actually a very emotionally and mentally abusive parent, especially to her children, but also to her husband. George was a very timid man with very low self-esteem. So he was very quiet, very submissive, and it's his wife is not going to lie, probably the reason why he got into drinking. And she would just verbally abuse him all the time. So she expected everyone around her to bend to her will, especially her children and her husband. His mother actually believed that La Crosse was a very wicked and evil city. She hated living there. She believed it was full of harlots and the devil's spawn. So she and her husband ended up selling their family grocery store and moving to Plainfield, Wisconsin in 1914. In Augusta's eyes, Plainfield was just slightly better than La Crosse was. Still super sinful, but their family home was far enough out of the town that she felt that they could be safe away from the evils of the world. And she preached, this is probably the most toxic thing that she would preach to her sons especially, was that women were evil. They're just plain and simple evil. She did not want them interacting with women at all. She just taught them women were evil, which I find really interesting that at no point were they like, well, if women are evil, wouldn't that make you evil, mother? Like, at no point did either of the boys question that. They just accepted it. And the only time they really left their home in Plainfield was to go to school, and Augusta forbade them from making any kinds of friends at school. They were not allowed to have any relationships outside of the family. But you know what? That was actually easier said than done because, well, no. So they didn't make any friends because Ed was not a very good-looking kid, and he was bullied a lot. So they had no problem keeping that promise to their mother that they wouldn't make friends at school because they got bullied a lot, especially Ed. He got very, very bullied. And after graduation, after high school graduation, Ed basically stopped socializing. He never went out with any friends because he didn't have any. He basically just stayed home and only interacted with his family, and specifically his mother. He idolized his mother, and so spending this time with her was no big deal at all. And for a while after Ed graduated from high school, things were pretty quiet with the family. There's not a whole lot of information because, they were just living their lives and everything was totally fine. Well, that is until 1940, when his father actually passed away from heart failure. This was devastating to his mother and ramped up her crazy level by a ton. So at this point, Ed is just obsessed with his mom and would literally do whatever she asked. He idolized her. He believed that she was a saint and would never leave him or lead him astray. So she was very emotionally and mentally manipulative and abusive to the point where he didn't even realize he was being abused at this point. It was just his life, and his mother was his life. So I want to talk a little bit about this because there's a lot of complex things going on psychologically with this case that I find fascinating. And I genuinely feel like that Ed was kind of suffering a little bit with an Oedipus complex. If you don't know what the Oedipus complex is, it's named after a story where a man accidentally kills his father or intentionally kills his father so he can sleep with his own mother. Basically, it's what Freud said about it is a boy develops an unconscious infatuation towards his mother and simultaneously fears his father to be a rival. Now, I don't necessarily believe the part about him fearing that his father was a rival, but he definitely had an infatuation with his mother. And I would take a step out there to say that he was probably in love with his mother, but didn't know it. And I think part of this unhealthy relationship was how she demonized women and made it so she was the only woman in his life that could possibly matter. And so instead of being able to, be normal and have a crush on a girl or date girls, he channeled all of that kind of energy towards his own mother. This is what I believe. This is just my assessment of the situation, is because of all the demonizing she did of other women, he really focused all of, those manly urges towards the only woman that he really believed was safe, and that is his mother. And I'm not saying they had that kind of relationship. I don't think they did. It was just a very abusive, controlling relationship. And because he wasn't allowed to have those kinds of feelings towards women, he didn't really know what to do with them. So he just became obsessed with his mom. So his older brother, though, didn't really fall into this kind of trap. He definitely did not worship their mother like Ed did. He was kind of rebellious and didn't want to go along with what his mother was saying, and he wanted to have his own life. He wanted to get married and have relationships outside of the family. And so at one point, after being forbidden from being able to have any kind of relationships outside of the family, let alone a romantic relationship, his older brother Henry actually became intimate with a divorced woman. They began dating and seeing each other, and he would go to her house, and this was just so appalling, just horrendous for his mother. She could not believe that he would be so rebellious and abandon her like he did to be with this other woman. So she actually ended up disowning Henry. And Henry at this time tried to convince Ed to come with him and say, look, you can be free. You don't have to believe what our mom is saying. Women aren't evil. Just come with me. Come see what the world is like. Experience it for yourself and then decide what you want to do. But Ed would have none of it. He knew what he wanted, and it was his mom. He wanted to be with his mom forever. So despite all of his efforts, Henry, tried to move on with his life. Well, one day in 1944, the two brothers were actually working on their farmland together, trying to burn off some weeds in their field to clear the field out. Well, the fire got out of hand. It got way too big. And so during the chaos of the flames raging and them trying to figure out what to do, Henry actually disappears into the flames. Now, when the police finally come and they're able to actually put the fire out, they find Henry in the weeds, dead. He had a severe blow to the back of his head, though. So it's interesting because his cause of death was actually ruled as smoke inhalation, and no one ever questioned why he had a severe blow to the back of his head. No one ever had any thoughts about that. But when you find out more about Ed, when we dive a little deeper into this twisted tale, you'll see that it's pretty likely that Ed actually killed his brother. And I wouldn't be surprised if he did it because of his mother. Like, not that his mother requested him to do it, because she was actually devastated at the death of Henry. Absolutely devastated at the news. So much so that it actually ended up giving her a stroke, leaving her disabled and completely reliant upon Ed. But I think that Ed probably was trying to defend his mother in a way and almost avenge her, because he was choosing to do these things that were completely opposite of what their mother would like. So this is total conjecture. I'm totally making this up, but I think he genuinely thought he was doing it for his mother and killed his brother, basically out of revenge for leaving the family. But again, they never ruled it as a homicide. They never said that Ed actually killed his brother. They deemed his death accidental by smoke inhalation. They questioned that later, but they never actually changed that. So anyways, so Augusta had her stroke upon hearing about Henry's death. So now Ed and Augusta are alone together. And between 1944, when she had her stroke, to 1945, their relationship got really toxic and really bad. Things were just really abusive, really bad, and it just continued to get worse and worse in their relationship, to the point where they basically never left the house unless they were needing supplies or something like that. So it was a very isolating time where those two just fed off of each other's toxicity. I'm gonna be able to speak. So Ed and his mother, like I said, very, very rarely left their home. And Ed was becoming more and more controlled by his dependent mother because she's disabled at this point. So she's fully dependent on him to provide everything for her. Now, there's a story that in 1945, they actually did make a rare trip out of the house to go to town to buy some supplies from a man. And when they stopped at the man's house, while Ed and his mother were there talking to the man, he ended up beating a dog to death. They witnessed this man, even though she literally just watched a man beat a poor innocent dog to death. She didn't care about that, beating up the dog and killing the dog. And, Augusta was just so upset at this show. But it wasn't what you're thinking. She was not upset at the man for beating the dog to death. She was upset because the woman who came out of the house was not the man's wife. She was appalled and could not believe the sin that she was witnessing, even though she literally just watched a man beat a poor innocent dog to death. She didn't care about that. She had no feelings towards that. It was all about a woman who wasn't his wife coming out of the house. She didn't know the full story. It could have been his sister or a relative visiting, or they didn't know. She just assumed the worst and thought, oh, they are so sinful, they are horrible, and they vowed just never to leave again because, oh, the world is just so full of sin, and I just cannot live in a world like this. So she would use that incident as a teaching moment for Ed to show how evil and manipulative women were, and that they were just lustful creatures who would deceive a man just to get him in bed and all of these other things. She really vilified women. Like, women were her devil, her Satan. Like, she vilified women to the point where any interaction with them was just damning and you would be doomed forever. But on December 29th, 1945, everything would change. This was the tipping point. This is when things start going south. I mean, that's saying something because it's pretty south, right? He's in this abusive relationship with his mother, isolated and everything. But it gets worse because on December 29th, Ed's mother passes away of another stroke. So Ed is now left all alone in the world. And at this point, he is 39 years old, okay? He has been with his mother this whole time, lived at home with his parents this whole time, was obsessed with his mother, did everything that his mother wanted him to the T, and now she was gone. He was alone, and he could do whatever he wanted. So the first thing he did was he actually boarded up her bedroom so it would never be touched again, left exactly how she left it, as if she had never left the bedroom. He boarded it all up. He boarded up most of the other rooms in the home. He basically lived out of 2 rooms in the entire house. And the house fell to squalor. It was a mess. Like, he did not take care of anything. He basically didn't care because his mother was gone. He could do what I wanted, and he could live out of these 2 rooms and basically let the house fall apart. So, being alone, again, he didn't leave the house very often, even though now his mother was gone. He could do whatever he wanted. He stayed home a lot by himself, slowly sinking into insanity. He was slowly going crazy, and he became obsessed with horror novels and pornography and something very interesting, Nazi medical exam books. So this was in 1946. The war had just ended. All the information about what had happened in the concentration camps, all the medical experiments that were performed, all of that information had just been released to the public. They were all just starting to learn about the atrocities committed by the Nazis. Well, Ed became obsessed with those medical journals and documentation from all of the medical experiments that the Nazis conducted. So he's reading horror films, he's reading these Nazi medical exam books, and he's watching porn. He's viewing porn. I guess they couldn't really watch it. They didn't really have TVs, but he had a lot of porn. And he feverishly studied female anatomy. This is where I think the demonizing of women, he was suppressing a lot of feelings and a lot of curiosities. Like, basically, when you tell a child, like, don't go in that room, you can't go in that room because you're hiding, like, Christmas presents or something in there. What is the kid going to do once you're not around? They're going to go into the room because they want to see what it is. His curiosities have been bottled up so much about women and females and all of that the second his mother was gone, it just like exploded. He became obsessed and wanted to know all the information. But at this point, that information would be twisted with his mother's teachings about women. So they were no longer like another human, and he wasn't discovering another human and about how other people worked. No. He was discovering about an animal, another creature, an evil creature that could destroy him. So he was diving into that with that twisted mindset of women aren't real, like, people. They're evil and bad. But I'm also fascinated with them, and I'm sure he had a lot of desires towards women that went unfulfilled. So now that he was free, that is what he focused on. And then he took up another hobby. Just a fun, no big deal hobby that is going to play a role later in this story. A big role later in this story. And that new hobby was taxidermy. You know, the stuffing of dead animals and, you know, saving them, like when you go hunting and those houses that have deer heads and bears. I've never understood it, but to each their own. So he really dove headfirst into taxidermy. Now, in 1947, he decided that he really wanted to take his taxidermy skills to the next level. He wanted to step that up. So he started another hobby. This is a hobby that we've heard about a little bit on this podcast. H.H. Holmes really liked this hobby. So some of you seasoned listeners will know what this hobby is. Grave digging. He started robbing graves. And we've talked about this before with the H.H. Holmes, but this man takes grave robbing to a whole new level. I tell you what. So H.H. Holmes did it to con people out of money by doing like fake deaths and that kind of thing, which is wholesome compared to why Mr. Ed is robbing graves. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So he started robbing graves, but he only robbed specific graves, not everyone's graves, very specific ones. And I bet you can guess which ones those would be. If you said women's graves, you are right. Ding, ding, you win. He only stole women's bodies. He would only dig up women's graves. So when he first started doing this, he would steal various body parts, hearts, heads, and other parts of the body. And he would take those home with him, but he would rebury the rest of the body. Well, as he continued, the longer he did this, he stopped leaving the body and would just bring them home. So in the early 1950s is when he actually stopped leaving the bodies at their grave. Like, he would literally rebury them. After he dug them up, he would take what he wanted and then rebury them. He decided he wanted all of it. So he would just start taking the bodies home with him. Now later, when he was actually interviewed by the police, Ed would state that he never actually remembered robbing the graves. He said when he would enter the graveyard, things would get really hazy and he couldn't remember what happened. It was just very fuzzy, and he genuinely didn't remember that he had robbed these graves. I don't know if I fully believe that because of things later in the story, and the fact that he took mementos home with him, like, there's no way he could be like, oh, where did this stuff come from? Oh my gosh, it's appeared out of nowhere. He had to know, right? But he claimed that he had no idea. It was just a fuzzy memory for him. So anyways, 1950s, he starts bringing these bodies home. Now, while he was doing his grave robbing hobby, Ed had to provide for himself. He still needed to eat. He still needed to have money. So he had a couple jobs. One of them was a handyman. He'd go around fixing things for people, or like painting or whatever. Anything people really needed to do. So he was a handyman. And the second job he had, guys, I can't even on this one. This one's going to blow your mind. You're not even going to believe me when I tell you this, but I promise you, this is real. His other job, I literally put insert shock face in my notes. His other job was being a babysitter. That is right. People entrusted their children to be alone with this man. And at this time, he's robbing graves. He's just digging up people and taking mementos. He was a babysitter. A babysitter. Just. Okay. Anyways, moving on. I'm just so shocked by that. It was just so shocking when I read that. So, to thank a lot of his employers for letting him work for them and babysit their children. Oh my gosh. Even saying it just sounds ridiculous. To thank them, he often presented them with a gift. He gifted them meat wrapped in paper that he himself butchered, and he presented them with venison. If you don't know what venison is deer meat. He often presented them with gifts of venison. I'll give you a hint. It It wasn't venison. It wasn't venison. He was not giving them venison. That's as detailed as I can get into that, but just know the gifts he was giving was not venison. You can use your imagination. You'll figure it out. But up until 1954, they believed that all Ed had really done was just grave robbing and a couple other things with the grave robbing, not actually killing anybody. And by other things, I will mention, I'm not going to go in super graphic detail about the stuff that Ed has done. I'm just forewarning you because it is sick and disgusting. And I will just give you a vague idea of what it is because nobody needs to know those details. I know them for you, so you don't have to. Okay? So, moving on. So he hadn't actually killed anybody up until 1954. But don't worry, that soon would change. In December of 1954, in fact, on December 8th, he would kill his first victim. And her name was Mary Hogan. Mary actually worked at a bar that Ed would frequent when he was wanting alcohol. So like I said, he wasn't very social, but he did like to drink. So she worked at a bar that he would often visit, and Mary looked very similar to Ed's mother. And the police believe that that is why they think she was targeted, is because she looked so close to his mother. So he actually shot her with a shotgun, killed her at the bar, and dragged her into the snow. No one saw this happen. And he actually took her home. And this is where I start getting really vague on the details of what happened at this point. Just know for a hint as to the horrors, Ed kept a box of noses under his bed. Women's noses under his bed. So you can use your imagination and guess what may have happened to Mary Hogan, as well as with, the gifts of venison. So next, it would actually take a few years before Ed would end up killing someone again, because he didn't end up killing his next victim until 1957. So it had been a while since Mary Hogan had vanished. No one knew where she was. They just knew she was gone, and they had no leads. They had no ideas of where she could be. And, the town thought Ed was a weirdo, but there was nothing too triggering about him. He babysat their children, so he must be an amazing human, right? Anyways, so on November 16th, 1957, Ed would actually kill his second victim, Bernice Warden. Now, Bernice owned her own hardware store where Ed would frequent. He would get supplies there and that kind of thing. And he actually shot Bernice with a .22 rifle from the store. He actually used one that was in the store to kill her. And after he had shot her in the store she owned, he would drag her out back to his truck and drive her home. Now, Bernice's son, Frank Warden, he was actually a sheriff's deputy and had come to visit his mother that day and noticed Ed kind of hanging around the store and acting a little sus, right? He was walking around and not really purchasing anything. He was just hanging around. So Frank kind of took note of that after he, was done visiting his mother and said goodbye. He left, and it just kind of just kept bugging him. It just kept staying on his mind, that was so weird. Why was Ed hanging around like that? That's so bizarre. What's going on? But, he trying to, push it aside. Well, 8 hours after his mother had been killed, he hadn't heard anything. And so he went to the store again to check on her. And she wasn't there. He couldn't find her. So remembering that Ed had been there and acting a little off. And by a little off, I mean like more off than he normally was, because he was a weirdo. Like, the whole town knew that he was a strange man. He gave off really weird vibes. They knew he was a little bit crazy, which again is why my mind is just blown that he babysat children. Anyways, I'll stop obsessing over that. It confuses me. But everyone knew he was a little off. And so to say that Frank noticed that Ed was more off than usual, yeah. Anyway, so he noticed a trail of blood in the back of the store, leading to the back door and out into the snow. And that's when his police radar went off and was like, all right, something has happened. And he immediately knew that Ed had to have had something to do with this. So he called in his department and said, okay, my mother is missing. We need to figure out what happened to her. And we're going to Ed's house to figure out what is going on, because my mom is gone. I can't find her anywhere. And there's this big trail of blood. Something has happened to my mom. So they immediately opened an investigation into Ed. And the police would soon arrive at Ed's home, and they began their investigation in the barn. And I tell you right now, what awaited them in that barn would traumatize them for the rest of their lives. And it gets worse. So they actually found Bernice Warden's body tied upside down and gutted with her head missing, basically like an animal that Ed had hunted and cleaned. That's how they found her body. They didn't know where her head was or anything. And so they saw a bunch of tools and things in the barn. It was just horrendous. Well, they thought it couldn't get any worse. And they were wrong. Because next they had to head to the house and investigate the house. And they didn't know what house of horrors they were about to enter. And when I tell you it's a house of horrors, I'm not even exaggerating. Like, when they first entered Ed's house, they found poo all over. And all over. He did not believe in using the bathroom. Just wherever he felt like it, he just went. So there was poo everywhere. All over. There were flies. So many flies. Just everywhere. And it smelled so bad. It was just filthy and decrepit and just horrible. And that wasn't nearly the worst part of what they found. And again, I am not going to go into a ton of detail about what they found, because it is just honestly so disgusting. Like, it is so gross. And like I said, I know the information so you don't have to, because it is gross. I'll give you a hint. They found his dinner ready to be cooked on the stove. It's not something any normal person would eat, ever. Basically, Ed was just like our friend Idi Amin. He liked eating people. And he used body parts as decorations and normal everyday objects around his home. He even made clothes and lampshades out of other people's skin. You know, the taxidermy skills he has. That is as detailed as I want to get, because it gets so much worse. He was disgusting. So that's the details that I'm gonna give you. So we're gonna move on. We'll move on. So at 4 a.m. on November 17th, 1954, they actually found Mary's head. And again, I am not going to go into detail about how they found it or the state that it was in. Just know twine, a hammer, and nails were involved with her head. That is all the detail I can give you. This man is sick. Very sick in the head. So they did actually find her, and one of the investigators, this is how bad it is, guys. One of the investigators named Art Schley, I think is how you say it, Schley, Schley, was so upset that, and he was so disturbed by the scene that he actually beat Ed's head against a brick wall until Ed confessed to the murders of Mary and Bernice. And actually within a few months of Art seeing the scene and experiencing this traumatic event in his life, seeing what Ed had done, Art actually suffered from a heart attack and died. And a lot of his friends claimed that the cause of his death was the trauma in seeing what they found in Ed's house. This is how bad it is, guys. It literally gave a man a heart attack and killed him because it was so traumatic. And I would have probably felt the same way if I would have discovered the things that they had discovered. Now, they believed that Ed only killed 2 people before he was caught. Thank heaven. And most of the things that they found in the home, they believed, were from bodies that he had stolen from the graveyard. A lot of this is because they actually would go to the graveyards and look for graves that he had dug up and counted all the missing bodies. So they were able to actually determine that, yeah, they were pretty sure he had only killed 2 people, which, you know, this is probably not great to say, but luckily his second victim was the sheriff deputy's mother. Because I don't know how much longer, like how long he would have been able to get away with killing people. But he just happened to kill the wrong person whose son knew how to investigate and actually witnessed him there at the store being sketchy. So, in 1957 on November 17th, Ed was arrested, and his story spread like wildfire. So on November 18th, just 2 days later, his crimes and his picture spread everywhere. He was even featured in Life magazine and Time magazine because his home was such a house of horrors that people were just mind blown that something like this could happen in their city. On November 21st, 1957, his trial would actually begin, and he pled not guilty due to insanity. And by January of 1958, they actually found him unfit to stand trial because he was literally insane. Like, he was unfit due to insanity. So he was actually sent to Central State Hospital for the mentally ill. And spoiler, this is a spoiler actually, he would spend the rest of his life there. But trust me, this is not the end of the story. In the hospital, he was known as such a polite patient. He became a carpenter and a medical orderly, and he was just outstanding. Everybody loved him, and he was sweet, and he was kind, and everyone just really liked him because he was such a this is ironic to say, a decent person in the hospital. So on March 20th in 1958, Ed's home actually burned to the ground. there were people trying to turn his home into a museum, and the people weren't wanting that, obviously, because it was horrible and horrendous. And so the home burned down. They claim it was an accident, but they're pretty sure somebody intentionally started the fire so they could not create that museum. In addition to that, on March 30th, they actually held an auction to sell any of Ed's remaining objects or things that he owned. People were obsessed with this story. Like, it was just such a crazy story, and people were obsessed with it. So they auctioned off all of his remaining things. And in 1962, there were a bunch of workers actually clearing the Gien property and found human bones. So they started collecting any remains that they were able to find and ended up burying those remains respectfully, finally, for those individuals that didn't get to rest in peace. But on November 7th, 1968, they finally decided that Ed was now mentally fit to stand trial for the murder of Bernice Worden. They never actually convicted him or tried him for Mary Hogan's murder because, they had enough proof to get him on Bernice's murder. So they never actually convicted him or charged him with Mary Hogan's murder because they didn't have enough evidence at the time. Because remember, this is before DNA testing and any kind of forensic science. This was like just before all of that stuff started taking off. So they didn't really have enough to say he for sure killed Mary Hogan. But he actually pled guilty to the killing of Bernice Worden. And only 7 days later, they would find him guilty of murdering Bernice. But he was deemed insane at the time of the murder. So instead of sending him to jail, they actually sent him back to the mental hospital. That's why I said, spoiler, he lives the rest of his life there, because he does, even after he was convicted of Bernice's murder. Now, on July 26, 1984, he actually died of lung cancer, which is crazy to me that, okay, so this is going to tell you how old I am. That seems so close to like this time period to me, because 1984 to me does not seem like it was that long ago. But that's when he died, was in 1984. He died of lung cancer. And ironically, his body would actually end up being buried in the same cemetery that he stole bodies from. I swear, these killers all have these like strange connections at the end of their lives to the crimes that they committed. Like Jolly Jane was paranoid of being poisoned because she poisoned everyone. So she went crazy at the end of her life thinking she was going to be poisoned. H.H. Holmes made sure that his coffin was buried in cement because he didn't want his body to be dug up. And here we are with Ed Gien, like, his body's buried in the same exact cemetery he stole bodies from. It's crazy to me. And ironically, in the year 2000, someone actually stole his tombstone. I know you're thinking I was going to say body. No, they did not steal his body. They stole his tombstone. Like, his grave became such an attraction to people that people would actually sneak into the graveyard and steal pieces of his headstone. Like, throughout the years, they just grab it and be like, look, I got a piece of his headstone. Look how cool I am. And then someone just stole the whole thing at some point in 2000. So, ironically, his body was not stolen, but his headstone was. And, now that you've heard the story, I'm curious, what books, movies came to your mind as I was talking? What do you think was inspired by Ed Story. There's quite a few, and I'm going to go through those really quick, and I'm sure you're going to see the connection. First one, Psycho by Robert Bloch. And it was actually made into a movie by Alfred Hitchcock. If you haven't watched Psycho, highly recommend it. Super good. And you will 1000% see the connection to Ed's story with Psycho. Like, that's all I kept thinking as I was reading this story. I'm like, oh, he's obsessed with his mom. This is just like Psycho. This is crazy. Well, that's not the only one he inspired. He also inspired a thing called Texas Chainsaw Massacre. You know, Leatherface. That is also inspired by him. So if that'll give you a hint to some of the crimes that he committed. He also inspired Silence of the Lambs, Buffalo Bill. So since I didn't go into massive detail about the crimes he committed, maybe knowing those stories will help you more fully understand what Ed did to, I would say, his victims, but I guess they are victims because they never got to rest in peace. And again, I just have so many thoughts about the psychological aspect of this story. Like, I think because he was so forbidden to see women as women that they did become objects. So he had no problem treating them like he would animals because they were these evil, satanic things that his mother did not want him to be around. But he did have the urges that any normal man would want. A lot of people believe that he just wanted to be his mother. And that would make sense with knowing some of the stuff that he did with the bodies that I am not going to get into. But a lot of people believe that he just wanted to be his mom because he idolized her that much. So there's a lot like that. Oedipus complex, I am positive, played a role in this. And it's just the psychological aspect of this, I think, because he was denied natural human desires, that when his mother was gone, it just exploded. So, anyways, so that is Ed. He was a very, very sick man, very mentally unwell, and thankfully only was able to kill 2 individuals, which is very sad, and the loss of any life is very tragic. And thankfully, he was stopped before he could kill more people. I just wish he would have been able to be stopped before he committed all the other horrendous things that he did. And he has had such an inspiration across pop culture, especially in the horror realm, that it shows us, it helps teach us what kind of evil people are actually capable of. So he made a lasting impact that no one is going to be able to forget. And that is why Ed Gien is our horrible human in history this week. So next week, we are actually going to be switching things up a little bit. We're going to be going to the South. In the 1880s in the South, we are going to be talking about Marie Delphine McCarthy from New Orleans. If you have not heard about this woman, oof, get ready. She was a slave owner, and I mean, think Elizabeth Bathory vibes on this one. We're going to Delphine McCarthy, Marie Delphine McCarthy. She is going to be our next horrible human, and I'm excited to share more information about her next week. So make sure you turn in, guys. Turn in for the night after hearing these creepy stories. No, tune in next week as we talk about Marie Delphine McCarthy, and make sure you share, like, subscribe, tell everybody about this. Make sure you check out my Instagram. It's Horrible Humans in History. Just so you can see these pictures of these people, so you get an idea of the kind of people we're dealing with. But thanks for joining me today on HHH, and we'll see you next week.